What is indigenous sovereignty and how is it claimed? Imagine a community that has governed itself for generations, with its own laws, traditions, and connection to the land. This is the essence of indigenous sovereignty. It is the right of indigenous peoples to govern themselves, keep their cultural identities, and manage their lands and resources without outside interference. This idea recognizes indigenous nations as separate political entities with authority over their territories and cultural heritage. Indigenous sovereignty works on two levels. First, it is the inherent self-determination that exists regardless of whether governments recognize it. This self-governance stems from traditional knowledge, spiritual practices, languages, social systems, and deep ties to their land. It is a continuous right that exists as long as the people uphold it. Second, tribal sovereignty refers to the legal recognition granted by national laws, like the United States Constitution, which treats tribes as distinct governments with powers similar to federal and state governments. The U.S. Constitution recognizes three sovereign entities: the federal government, state governments, and tribal nations. It gives Congress authority over Indian tribes, acknowledging them as separate political bodies. This creates a system where tribes can set up their own governments, decide who belongs to their communities, make laws, and run courts and law enforcement. This legal framework supports their claim to sovereignty. Indigenous peoples claim sovereignty through various methods. One major way is through treaties, formal agreements negotiated with the United States. Nearly 400 treaties exist, and they are recognized in the Constitution as the highest law of the land. These treaties are not grants but agreements that reserve certain rights for indigenous nations. Courts have ruled that treaties are rights reserved by indigenous peoples, not rights granted by the government. Another way is through constitutional recognition. The Constitution explicitly states that Congress has authority over Indian tribes, which affirms their status as governments. Tribes also establish their own governments by creating constitutions, setting up courts, and enforcing laws within their communities. These actions are practical demonstrations of sovereignty. International legal instruments also support indigenous sovereignty. Documents like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the International Labour Organization Convention, number 169, affirm indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, autonomy, and control over lands and resources. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent means indigenous communities must agree before projects affect their lands. Cultural and traditional authority is another key aspect. Indigenous sovereignty is expressed through maintaining languages, spiritual practices, and cultural institutions. These traditions operate independently of government recognition and show that indigenous peoples have the right to govern their communities based on their own values and systems. From an ethical and political perspective, indigenous sovereignty raises important questions about justice and power. It challenges the idea that only nation-states have legitimate authority. Recognizing indigenous sovereignty involves addressing past injustices caused by colonization and dehumanization. It also involves respecting their right to make decisions about their lands, resources, and cultural practices. In practice, sovereignty claims often face obstacles. Laws like the Dawes Allotment Act and policies of termination have limited tribal authority. Courts have sometimes upheld restrictions that reduce indigenous self-governance. These actions raise ethical questions about whether governments are truly honoring their commitments to indigenous peoples. Contemporary issues also include indigenous data sovereignty. This means indigenous communities have the right to control information about their people and lands. It is both an ethical stance and a political move to ensure their voices are heard and their identities protected. Finally, indigenous sovereignty is linked to environmental justice. Many tribes claim authority over their lands to protect sacred sites and natural resources. This connects sovereignty to broader questions about who decides how natural resources are used and who bears the environmental impacts. Overall, Indigenous sovereignty is a complex mix of legal rights, cultural traditions, and political assertions. It is rooted in the idea that Indigenous nations have always been self-governing and that this right should be recognized and respected by all. How governments respond to these claims shows their commitment to justice, equality, and respecting the diverse ways communities govern themselves.